Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming to the seminar and coming to the talk. I appreciate it. This talk is going to be about race, crime, and public policy. And so just to give you a little roadmap, what I'm going to do is talk about the problem, go through some of the numbers, and go through some of the current data about what is the current state of the carceral state, the current state of our criminal justice system, and then go into some of those policy suggestions or fixes that people are throwing out there today to rectify some of these issues we see. But first, I got to get us all on the same page because it's a little difficult to slice the cake if you bake it before you mix it. All right, so here we go. So get myself out the way. All right, so what's the problem? The problem is that the criminal justice system has expanded rapidly, and it's been in an invasive expansion throughout almost every aspect of our lives here in the United States. And it is put into everyday contact, right, of quotidian nature, the punitive governmental power into the everyday lives of some people. Right. And the some part is very important because not everyone is feeling the brunt or feeling the expansion of the carceral state as opposed to others. And this has serious adverse effects for people's individual lives, their individual choice making, also for their social environments, their economic outcomes and economic prosperity. And also it has a lot of political consequences, which is what I look at mostly in my research. And also for those who experience that contact with the police or contact with the carceral state, but also people in their network, right? So their families, their communities, right? Once an area is over policed or once someone in your family has contact with the criminal justice system, it is very debilitating for the entire family. And the central problem with American policing or the unique American carceral state is that crime and punishment are not directly related to criminal activity. Crime and punishment are not directly related to criminal activity. Some of you sitting out there right now are criminals, right? And I don't mean to say that you did 5 years in jail, but some of you have drank underage. Some of you have used illicit drugs. Some of you have sped, didn't follow stop signs, cheated on your taxes, whatever. But the thing is that crime and punishment are not directly related to criminal activity. Deviancy is an earned status, right? It is not an earned status, right? Doing those things didn't make you a deviant. Deviancy is a social construction. We decide as a society who is a deviant, right? And crime and punishment are policy outcomes. What is a crime is based on public policy. The punishment of that is based on public policy. The idea that some crimes are more policed than other crimes is a public policy choice. So what about the numbers? In 1973, America started seeing a sustained and substantial rise in its incarcerated population. Now, during this time, there was a rise in crime, right, through the 60s, 70s, 80s. But as that rise teetered off and started to come down, we didn't see a one-to-one correlation with decreases in the incarcerated population. And so since the 70s, we have seen the creation of what we call mass incarceration and the creation of what we term the carceral state. The carceral state being the manifestation of all these things: probation, parole, cameras, monitoring systems, surveillance system, community corrections, police and schools, like resource officers, all these things incorporated within the carceral state. And so in 1972, we had an incarceration rate of 161 per 100,000 people. And by last year's count, 2019, or 2019, 2 years ago, the rate was 639 per 100,000. That's a 500% increase over 40 years, a 500% increase. Currently, there are 2.19 million people incarcerated in the United States. That is not to count the 7 million, roughly 7 million, who are on probation or parole in the United States. So altogether, we have roughly 9 to 10 million people in the United States who are under control, either incapacitated in the prison or on community corrections within the United States. So in 2020, because of COVID, we did see an unprecedented decrease in the United States carceral population, prison population. And so when I say US prisons, I mean state prisons and federal prisons. The population fell from 2.19 in 2019 to 1.8 million in 2020. So they were letting people out. And some of that is because of COVID, and also some of that is because of political pressure to let people out of prisons. The national jail population decreased by about 182,000 people, which is a 17% decrease. Now, jails are where you go for 60 days, 90 days, everything from a year to under a year to a year or under a year, you would stay in a county jail or something like that. It also decreased 17%. However, it did come back. It was creeping back up towards the end of 2020. So it went down in the first 6 months and started creeping back up in the second latter part of the year. However, there's still a 17% decrease, which is, like I said earlier, is unprecedented. We have not seen these types of decreases in the data since the 70s. Now, how do we get here? Well, bad policy, right? Politicians at various levels of government have passed policies or created criminal justice policies that have bad incentive structures. And they unfailingly produce bad outcomes for Americans, for too many Americans. And this is not a partisan problem. Democrats and Republicans alike have pushed forward bad criminal justice policies that have bad incentive structures that cause bad externalities for a lot of Americans. And to put this into perspective, in the 60s, right? In the 60s, Lyndon B. Johnson was the first president. Great Society, Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, all these big things are major legislations, positive legislations. He also passed the Safe Streets Act, right? He also passed, the Law Enforcement Assistance Act. And those two things, right? First, the Law Enforcement Assistance Act passed by LBJ was the one that created an avenue or funnel for federal funds to go directly to law enforcement, to local and state law enforcement. So he turned on the federal spigot for law enforcement agencies to get these federal funds. And the Safe Streets Act made that spigot permanent. And so, again, I'm saying Democrats and Republicans alike have done this, right? And right after him, Nixon comes along with the law and order campaigns, with the strategic plan to build more prisons, right? Under Nixon, we saw this expansion of the prison system because they put money into giving states money to build more prisons. We saw the shift from LBJ from the war on poverty going to the war on crime. Nixon turned it into the war on drugs, namely because Nixon and his campaign or his administration knew they would get no credit. No, because politicians want three things, right? They want power, they want good policy, and they want to get reelected. And so to do that, you have to do some credit claiming. And he knew that if they did something about robberies and assaults and burglaries and stuff like that, the local police departments would get the credit. But if he focused on federal crimes, i.e. drugs, then he would be able to take the credit for that. And so he switched from the war on crime to the war on drugs, not because drugs were a great problem, right? Drugs also ran a vein in between his three adversaries, right? So Black activists, counterculture people like hippies and stuff like that, and also anti-war people. So he figured he could strike a blow at all three of them through switching to the message on war on drugs. He also utilized the infrastructure that LBJ left him, which was LBJ started a federal bureaucracy that you now know as the DEA. So he used the DEA to enforce those things that was left to him by LBJ. And so that shift towards punitive policies, you would wonder, how is that possible? It's possible because the public doesn't really know much about crime, right? We don't really know much about crime. And so it's easy to fan the flames of fear. It's easy to say, you know, to get people to go along with these punitive policies, with these war on drug policies, war on drugs, meaning, you know, it's like a war on like you know, any type of other premonition or something like that, right? So we had to go through, people were easily manipulated by this type of stuff because we don't know as citizens much about crime. We always overestimate how much crime there is. We always overestimate who wants to commit crimes, right? In reality, in any you know, geographical area, there are few people that commit a lot of crimes, and most people like yourselves, you know, commit PD crimes or personal crimes that don't bother anybody, things like that. But most of the time, there's very few people that are committing serious felonies and things in the geographical area. And so, and to explain that a little bit better, I'm going to talk about what I like to call the demand for sin, right? And so the demand for sin, right? And you can take sin everywhere you want to take it. So it could be gambling or prostitution or drugs or, you know, anything to some like serious crimes like human trafficking or whatever, right? And so the true demand for sin is, as you can see, a little right of median, right? A little right of the middle of the distribution right there. And so what that means is that most people have a normal preference for sin, right? Those people have an average preference for sin. And so average preference for crime or doing things that would be illegal or, you know, against the morality police or something like that. And so the problem with that is that in terms of sin, the correlation between public behavior and private behavior is less than perfect. So in reality, most people, right? So you see the percent of the population on the left, most people don't have a problem with indulgence, right? They don't have a problem with vice. So most people have a very low demand for sin, or in this instance, a substitute crime. Most people have a very low demand for this. There's not a lot of people running around outside like it's, you know, The Walking Dead, or, you know, like it's a 90s crime movie, or like Goodfellas or something like that, right? Most people have a very low demand for sin, right? So, and the problem with that is that, again, bureaucrats, legislators, policymakers, in their mind, they think you're all, or most people are all foaming at the mouth to break the law, or to commit crimes, to do drugs, right? And so they say, well, if we legalize marijuana, everybody's going to do it. That's not true, right? If we legalize mushrooms, all your children are going to be on mushrooms. That's not true, right? But that's the perception, right? Think about now with the Cory Booker's bill to legalize marijuana and expunge marijuana convictions. And some of the pushback, even from Democrats, is that it's a gateway drug, right? I mean, how many years have to go by before people stop saying that, because it's just not true, right? But this is the perception. This is what this graph shows. The perception of bureaucrats and politicians is that all of you want it and you got to have it, right? And so you get policies that are for their belief system about how much crime you want, or how much sin you want to get into, as opposed to how society is really structured. Now, when you get to individual choice, right? So individual choice, you know, the consumer demand for things like this, right? When you're talking about individuals. Now, you have some people, this slide calls perverts, right? You have perverts. Perverts are people who don't care about the cost. These are people who, no matter what, they're going to do it, right? These are people who are addicted, right? People who have addiction problems, gambling problems, things like that. People who have, you know, all kinds of addictions to, you know, sexual addictions or whatever kind of addiction. These are people who do not care what the price is. If getting caught means 30 years in jail, that is like, you know, eating a peanut butter sandwich to them. They don't care, right? Those are people who have you know, their demand curve is flat. They don't care what the cost is. Then you have people like yourselves who are vicarious sinners, who would say, if they're underage drinking, right? Where's a safe place to underage drink? In the dorm, you'd be towards, towards the right of the scale, because you're more likely to do it because the price is low, right? Which means that the odds of getting caught are low. And if you are caught by a dorm person, the punishment is going to be minimal. So when the cost is low to violate some type of thing, you're more likely to do it. But as the cost goes up, reasonable people, right, average people, are less likely to commit crimes. They're less likely to desire these types of things. Now, you also have the what they call proto-nerds. And this is people who only a slight shift in the cost will make them not do it, right? These are people who any type of cost whatsoever, they're not going to do it. These are people who live in states that legalize marijuana, and you say, hey, are you going to start to use marijuana? And they say no, because I might have to get a job that drug tests or whatever. So the cost to them, any slight increase in the cost to them makes their demand drop to almost zero, right? So this is like the individual demand for this, okay? And so you can see how, through this kind of understanding, how we get policies that are bad, right? For one, politicians need to pass bills that they can take credit for. They want to get reelected. They want donations. And so it's easy to drum up people's emotions. It's easy to fan the flames of crime in order to do that, right? Because they have a different, elected people have a different perception as to how much crime there is and who wants to do it, as opposed to here, as you can see, the actual demand for crime and the actual demand for crime heterogeneously between the three buckets of people we have out there, right? And so another reason we see how easy it is to get these crime policies passed is because of the racialization of crime, right? This is a very effective way to politicize criminal justice policies. A great example of that would be George H.W. Bush and his Horton ad that he did running against the governor from Massachusetts. I think it was McGovern. I can't remember now. And so they had a furlough program in Massachusetts. The guy got furloughed for a weekend, committed a double homicide or something like that, or a homicide and a rape, just a horrific crime. And the person was Black. And so what George H.W. Bush did is said, oh, that guy's soft on crime. And he had an ad with Willie Horton's face, but he darkened the face to make him look like, darker skinned African-American. And they played that ad, and it was race baiting, right? It was associating crime with African-Americans. Like, this guy's soft on crime, and this is what crime is. Crime is dark, scary Black people. And so this works because American institutions, because we have elected judges, we have direct democracy, is very vulnerable to the politicization of social problems, very vulnerable to the politicization of social problems. Think about now. Think about the vaccine, COVID-19, wearing masks. We are very vulnerable to the politicization of social problems, and crime is no different. And so in the 60s, as I was saying, when you had the war on poverty and you had that shift to the war on crime, and then in the 70s to the war on drugs, you see issues like poverty, unemployment, inadequate housing turned into crimes, right? The criminalization of also poverty, of vagrancy, delinquency, lawlessness, right? We see a focus on youth, right? So you see all these new youth initiatives pop up in urban areas where police are running recreation centers, police are running like entertainment things for youth, not as a means to necessarily help these kids, but as a means to monitor them, to get their names, get their addresses, right? To be able to put them in the system, in some type of system, such that when a crime happens, they know who lives where, and who's more likely to do things like that. And it was a surveillance system, right? These things that are popping up, they're supposedly to help youth, but was putting them into some type of police surveillance state. And so right now, of the 2.9 million people incarcerated, 60% of those are persons of color, are people of color, 60%. And you have to think about this in relation to America, which is over 70% white, The Black population is around 11 or 12%. We're only 11 or 12% of the population. Hispanics are about 23, 24%, maybe 25% now of the population. But racial minorities, mostly Blacks and Hispanics, make up 60% of the prison population. If Blacks and Hispanics were incarcerated at the same rates as their white counterparts, the incarcerated population would drop by 50%. 50%. The incarceration rate for today for African Americans and Hispanics to white is 5 to 1 and 1.4 to 1. 1.4 to 1 doesn't sound like a lot, right? But you have to remember that Hispanics are disproportionately dispersed around the country, right? But African Americans are more concentrated in certain areas, and so 5 to 1, 1 to 4, you see a higher Hispanic incarceration rate in places that have higher concentrations of Hispanics, but they're not equally dispersed. They're not as dispersed as concentratedly dispersed as African Americans are. And so, since the 1960s, a Black man born since the 1960s, such as myself, is more likely to have spent time in prison than have a bachelor's degree. Of prime age Black men, which is 25 to 35, 15% of those who have not attended college, so 15% of those who are GED or college graduates, are incarcerated on an average day. 15% of that whole population. Of the 25 to 35-year-olds who have a high school diploma or GED, any given day, 15% of that population is incarcerated. Of that prime age group who did not graduate from high school, 30%, on any given day, 30% of Black men that are 25 to 35 that didn't finish high school are incarcerated at any given day. 30% of the entire population of that group, 25 to 35, high school dropout. In every state in the union, there's a higher proportion of Blacks incarcerated than whites, in every state. So it's not a Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana problem, in every state, right? So I'm gonna give you some examples here, right? Idaho. Now, I've never been to Idaho. I don't have anything against Idaho. I don't know if any of you from Idaho. If you are, congratulations, right? But I've been Black all my life, and I've never met a Black person who was born and raised in Idaho, right? But when you look at Idaho's incarceration rates, Black to white ratio, they incarcerate Black people, 4.7 Black people in prison to every one white person. 4 to 1 ratio in Idaho. In Montana, 6 to 1. There's 6 Black people in jail to every one white person in Montana. Montana. North Dakota, there's 5 Black people in prison to every one white person in North Dakota. In Maine, it's 6 to 1. There's 6 Black people in jail per one white person in Maine, right? And I compare that to Alabama, to where you would think, oh, this is where we're going to see like the huge numbers. It's 3 to 1, right? Not saying that this is a good number, right? I'm not trying to say that Alabama is doing some great job, right? What I'm saying is that, comparatively speaking, these other states have a higher proportion of their Black population in prison compared to Alabama. And Alabama has more Black people, right? So if they have more opportunity, I guess, which would be a bad way of saying it, to incarcerate. So the arrest rate for African Americans specifically is 1,400 per 100,000. The incarceration rate, right, which is nationally 639 per 100,000. If you just look at African Americans, it's 1,300 per 100,000. 1,300 per 100,000. And for Black male high school dropouts, so a specific group, Black men who drop out of high school, the incarceration rate is 35,000 per 100,000. 35,000 per 100,000. That is astonishing. That is like, that's like those guys going to space last week. It's crazy, right? It's crazy. So why is this, right? Well, for one reason, the war on drugs, right? Drug-related arrests for African Americans and Blacks is 4 times higher than that of whites. Blacks are 10 times more likely, or 10 times go to jail, 10 times the rate of whites. And whites, when you ask them about drug use, whites report drug use at a rate that's 5 times larger, right? So whites report drug use at 5 times the rate of blacks, but blacks go to prison for drugs at 10 times the rate of whites, right? And a good example of what this means, right? The arrest and stuff like that. There is there's a federal drug court in Boston, right? Federal drug court in Boston. And as of 2017, that federal drug court had never prosecuted a white person. A federal drug court in Boston, I know you've seen like the crime movies from Boston, like Whitey Bulger and all this type of stuff, right? Mafia from, whatever. They have never prosecuted a white defendant, never. That means that, again, 10 times more likely to go to prison, right? That means that something is happening to where they're not getting arrested, or if they are getting arrested, they're getting diversions from prison and court that African Americans are not receiving, right? And there is little evidence to show that blacks sell more drugs than whites. And when you look at large busts like trafficking hundreds of pounds of drugs, blacks make up a minuscule percent of those individuals caught trafficking large amounts of drugs, right? Large amounts of drugs. And so we're going to take a step back or a step forward to look at contact with police, right? So we're going to look at this data from, it's called Suspect Citizens. It looks at 20 million traffic stops in the state of North Carolina, which some of you are in, right? And so what this data finds, 20 million stops over a decade, data on every stop. So what happens is North Carolina passed a law. Police officers have to fill out a form every time they stop someone with a bunch of demographic information and the what happened information. And they turn that form in and it gets put into a big system, and a bunch of political scientists got that data. And so what they found is that blacks versus white drivers, there's a dramatically different odds of being pulled over if you're black as opposed to white. And they found that the black population is consistently over-policed, right? And what does that mean when you over-police a community, right? It means that a lot of people come into contact with police. It means that some of that contact is going to be negative, right? So there may be criminal activity. There may be people going to jail, which causes economic deprivation. It causes the social erosion, right? The bowling alone effect. It has a lot of reverberations, and so not only, right, are blacks and Hispanics more likely to be pulled over, they're also more likely to be searched, right? So you're talking about more likely to be pulled over, more likely to be pulled out of your car, and your car to be searched. And there are different types of stops. So a safety stop is you're actually doing something wrong. No signal, speeding, or whatever, right? Now we do know that there's 1,000,001 things you could be pulled over for on the interstate or on the highways. And so the cop doesn't need to look far to find a reason to pull you over. So a safety stop is is a quote unquote valid reason to pull someone over, speeding or whatever. During a safety stop, like a traffic stop or speeding, blacks are 49% more likely to be searched than their white counterpart. During an investigatory stop, which is I think they're up to something stop, blacks are 170% more likely to be searched. 170% more likely to be searched. Now, what does that yield? Well, and generally speaking, and we looked at this data, 30% of the time police find contraband, right? 50% of the time so 30% of the time they find contraband, 50% of that 30%, most times people get a ticket, right? So only 12% of those times, of that 50%, is there enough drugs to arrest somebody? So you're talking about finding like a roach, marijuana seed, or some kind of remnants of that there was some drug, some paraphernalia, a pipe or something, a needle, whatever. Most of the time it's not enough to arrest someone over, because you have to have a certain amount of weight to be arrested. So most of the time they find something that's not enough to arrest anybody over, right? However, when they do the searches, they find that compared to whites, blacks are 22% less likely to to have contraband. And Hispanics are 52% less likely than whites to have contraband. So for every type of search, for safety stops, investigatory stops, for every type of search, police are less likely to find contraband on Blacks than they are whites, and also Hispanics. Now, police are 22% less likely to find contraband when Blacks consent to a search, and they're also 12% less likely when they do a probable cause search. So I smell something in your car, you got to get out, right? And however, Black drivers being searched at 2 times the rate, right, have contraband just 33% of those searches. So you say to yourself, oh, 33%, that's a lot. But you're forgetting the part before that at 2 times the rate. So if you search 100,000 white vehicles, and then you search 200,000 Black vehicles, yeah, you're gonna find something, right? You just expanded the playing field. And so, however, even when they do find something, only 13% of those times it's enough to arrest somebody. And when it comes to the group they are the worst at predicting if they have something on them, or if they have a weapon or drugs, are young Black men. Police are extraordinarily terrible at deciding if a young Black man has drugs or something on him, right? The search rate for that is near, abysmal, because they assume they all do. Now, there is no question, right? So we talked about the state of the criminal justice system, kind of some of the reasons and whys the policies get bad, right? The incentive structure, the disconnect between what bureaucrats think and what the actual desire is for these types of things, misinformation about drugs, gateway, stuff like that. And then we talked about some of the racial disparities, right? And I want to reiterate this point that there's no question, right, that Blacks are more likely to be pulled over and searched than any other racial group. There's no question. When you look at the data, they look at the percent of the population that's Black. They look at if it's an urban or rural area, if it's a sheriff, a state trooper or a city police officer. And the data confirms that this disparity is not the cause, or not being caused by a bad apple, right? Some one person pulling over 1 million Black people. That's not the cause. It's not the cause of bad departments or bad apple departments where that whole department is corrupt. It's systemic, right? This is a systemic problem, right? There's no way to get around that. The data has confirmed it, it's confirmed it, it's confirmed it, it's confirmed it. This is a systemic problem. This is not a few bad apples. That is just something police unions say to not have to, to correct themselves. It just put all the problems on that person, right? That person works in the system, and that system has allowed that person to get that bad, right? It's a systemic problem, right? This is a racial systemic problem. And so what does this mean, right? I think it was important to understand, what does this mean for these individuals? What does this mean for the liberty, the opportunity, the economic opportunities for these individuals? What does this mean? Because putting someone in jail is the ultimate deprivation of liberty, right? It is you eat, drink, sleep, go to the bathroom when we tell you to. It's the ultimate deprivation of liberty. And having someone get out of their car, to search them, to hold them at gunpoint, these are serious violations of someone's personal freedoms. So what does this mean in state and nation, right? So let's look at Ferguson, Missouri. Some of you are probably familiar, but maybe too young to be too familiar. Ferguson, Missouri, I'll get to what happened, but so DOJ did a report or study of Ferguson Police Department because there was a serious incident. And they found that Ferguson, which was 70% Black, 30% white, at the time, that Blacks counted for 85% of the stops, 93% of the arrests, and 90% of the citations. 90% of citations. They were more likely to be pulled over, less likely to have contraband. They also were 88% more likely to have force used against them, and 90% of all documented cases of force were against African Americans. And a lot of these charges, 94% of the charges that people had to go to court for, were failure to comply. Can you imagine going to court for not having committed a crime, but having to go to court because you failed to come across the street or do what an officer told you to do? right? You haven't committed any crime other than not doing what they asked you to do, right? The failure to comply charge. 94% of all of those bogus, like not doing a crime but not obeying me, were of African Americans. In Ferguson was so bad that 16,000 of the 21,000 population had arrest warrants. 16,000 people out of 21,000 had arrest warrants, mostly for fines and fees. Remember, 90% of the citations for African Americans, they had a real weird court system. They had like different strange days, strange hours to make it so you couldn't go to court, such that they would be able to put a debtor warrant out against you. So 92% of the debtor warrants were used against Blacks, and 96% of all arrests made exclusively for a debtor warrant. Police are coming to arrest people because they can't pay tickets for failure to comply, right? And what does this mean for those individuals living in that city? First, there's an economic extraction. So Ferguson Police Department took, over the span of 3 or 4 years, $1.2 million to $3 million from these individuals. So it's economic extraction, so essentially predation, economic predation. Also, Blacks make up 95% of all jaywalking charges. 95% of all jaywalking charges. So the police are stopping people crossing the road and giving them a ticket, even in residential areas, right? And it led to this. Mike Brown was killed by a police officer, and he was shot 6 times. The reason the police officer encountered him, had made contact with him, was because he was jaywalking. So literally, he died from over-policing of things like jaywalking. Jaywalking. When you look at other places like New York City, now New York City stop and frisk was ruled unconstitutional, but before that, between 2004 and 2012, they made 5 million stops and frisked like 2.4 million people. 5 million stops, frisked 2.4 million people, 90% of which were people of color. Even when you control for precinct level data, and what that means is, if you're on the rich, fancy side of Manhattan, where there aren't many people of color, they still stop more people of color over there as opposed to white people. And the data that they collected shows that, like every time else, it's more efficient to stop whites because whites are more likely to have contraband and weapons compared to people of color. So they took a survey of people in New York City, and they found that 44% of young people in New York City have been stopped multiple times. Some people in New York City get stopped multiple times a day, going to work, coming from work, right? 71% of young people in New York have been frisked. 29 were not even given a reason. Think about that. Someone stops you, a police officer stops you, sometimes plainclothes, stops you, push you up against the wall, frisk you, and doesn't even tell you why. That is an ultimate affront to liberty of these individuals, right? 91% of those said the police threatened them or used physical force. 25% said the police displayed a weapon. So that could be baton, taser, gun, some type of weapon. And almost half of them, over half of them, said that they believed this treatment was based on race. Now, what does that mean? I don't know if you know the story of Khalid Browder. There's a great documentary on this on Netflix. This young man was going home. Someone said that, some store owner said that, I think that's the guy that stole my book bag a couple of weeks ago. The police stopped him on a stop and frisk and took him to Rikers. He didn't have money to bail out of Rikers. So he spent 3 years in Rikers, 3 years in Rikers after a stop and frisk. 3 years, never going to court because he didn't have money. The lawyers kept pushing it back. The prosecutor would push it back, and then his lawyers push it back. He spent 3 years in Rikers, a lot of that time in solitary confinement because he was fighting with other people in the gang. He was not in a gang, so the gangs were jumping on him and fighting. They have video of this. It's like horrific. He was innocent. When he got out, he was so traumatically, PTSD and so traumatized. He ended up taking his own life due to the inhumane treatment in Rikers Island. So over-policing, right, stop and frisk, literally killed this man. And look at Baltimore, Maryland. This is even more egregious, right? Black Baltimoreans are 3 times more likely to get stopped by police. Of 95% of the 410 people stopped by police, at least 10 times. At least 10 times over a 5-year span were Black. Some people were stopped at least, so this is more than 10, right? At least 10 times. 95% of the individuals stopped more than 10 times, 10 or more times, were Black, right? They found evidence that one man over 5 years was stopped 30 times by the police officers. They infringed upon this man's freedom of movement 30 times in 5 years, and not one time did they write a ticket. Not one time did they write a citation. Not one time he had done anything wrong worthy of reporting. And so what they also did, the Baltimore Police Department, which is just disgusting, is they engaged in unconstitutional, obviously, strip searches. They would strip people, men, women, and juveniles, prior to any arrest and in public view, broad daylight, on a street corner, up against your car. They strip searched one Black woman in broad daylight. Her infraction was a headlight. Her headlight was out. They pulled her over, said they're gonna search her for drugs. They took her out of the car, opened her shirt, had a female officer go up under her bra. They had a female officer go into her cavities, right on the side of the street, and then they didn't find anything, they let her go. They had another incident where a teenage Black male, a Black boy, got stopped by police. The police officer stopped him, pulled the boy's pants down and underwear down in front of his girlfriend, looking for drugs, broad daylight, in front of his girlfriend, in front of everybody on the street, didn't find anything and just let him go. Now, what happens when you're aggressively policing like this? Freddie Gray, right? Freddie Gray was arrested by Baltimore Police Department and later died of a spinal cord injury, which was inflicted upon him by police. His crime was having a legal pocket knife. The police stopped him for some reason, found a legal pocket knife on him, broke his neck, threw him in a car, and drove him around for a bunch of time, long time, until he died. And they went on trial. The police officer that did this went on trial. However, I don't think they were convicted. I don't believe they were convicted, but again, a legal pocket knife. And so you can kind of see how, what I want to try to show you here is that these things have ramifications for people's liberty, their freedom, their right to movement, their rights not to be harassed, your amendment right not to unlawful search and seizure, right? This is an unlawful search and seizure, right? Why would you be arrested for having a legal item, right? It's just like arresting someone for having a Coke. It's a legal item, right? So these are implications of this are immense. They are serious. And the burden of this is falling on neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, and neighborhoods of color. The vast burden of this criminal justice system, this carceral state, the heavy weight of this is being felt by people in the poorest neighborhoods and people in those neighborhoods that are full of people of color. And this is stuff that's happening every day. Like all these examples I'm showing you are not unique. Ferguson is not some unique unicorn city. There are plenty of cities out here, especially in the Rust Belt area. And these, like, you've heard a town called speed traps. These are towns that make money off of tickets, right? They make a lot of their revenue off of tickets because the interstate goes through that town, and then they're able to ticket people and get money from them and have exorbitant fees and fines, right? There are predacious states, predacious levels of governance all throughout this country. Ferguson is no special case, right? This aggressive no tolerance policing they were doing in Maryland, that's not unique to Maryland. A lot of police departments used to use that no tolerance policing, right? So this has serious implications that are being borne by a specific group of people. Mass incarceration of the carceral state is spatially, geographically, and racially concentrated. It's spatially, geographically, and racially concentrated. And you can also say gendered, because the bulk of the individuals that go into this jail are males. And so what are people saying about it, right? So what are some of the solutions that people are putting out there? And so recently, we've had some of the liberals or Democrats come out and say, defund the police, abolish the police. And maybe some anarchists are out there thinking, yeah, we should just get rid of that. Well, defunding the police and abolishing the police doesn't make crime go away. I don't know what people think that like if you don't have police, then crime will go away. That's not the case. And the people who live in these neighborhoods, that are high crime neighborhoods, they want policing. They just want effective and better policing. They want the police to catch the bad guys and stop putting their foot in their ass, right? And so the defund the police and abolish the police is a catchy, a slogan, but it's not true policy, because what do you put in place of the police, right? Getting rid of the police does not make crime go away. It does not make people who are perverts, right, who are going to do it anyway, stop. It doesn't make people, and it doesn't make people who have, some type of cost benefit analysis stop, right? It may make it go up because the costs have been significantly reduced. Also, there have been cities like San Francisco who have stopped enforcement. San Francisco stopped enforcement of petty crimes like shoplifting. And the result is that people go into like the Walgreens and just steal shit. And Walgreens knows they're not going to get prosecuted, so they don't stop them. So what's happening is that Walgreens, because that's Walgreens' private property, you're allowing people to take other people's private property, right? They're shutting down Walgreens. Walgreens stores now in San Francisco are just saying, we're going to be here till we run out of supply. We're not bringing any more supply in. And once we run out, we're going to close the store. So what you're doing, A, is you're incentivizing people to steal other people's private property. And two, you're going to cause those communities to lose jobs, because Walgreens is not going to stay open if the city is not going to enforce property rights. There's also in-cash bail. Now, this is not all bad, right? I know some of you are probably thinking, who's going to talk about in-cash bail? Yeah, I'm going to talk about it because, I mean, you would think it sounds so great, right? But we have found, some of the recent data is that some of the cities and municipalities that have ended all cash bail, we have found that crime has increased in those areas. Why? Because some people need to be incarcerated until their court date. Violent criminals need to be incarcerated until their court date, right? So if you have a thing where there is no bail whatsoever, that means I could go out and assault someone with a baseball bat, get arrested, get arraigned, and just walk right back out. 48 hours, 24 hours, maybe 12 hours if it's quick, right? And I can get right back out. So it's not about ending cash bail. It's about reforming cash bail. It's more of an appropriate tax. Also, implicit bias training, right? A lot of people, or Democrats, think this is like be all end all of training people to be nice to one another, when there's little evidence that this does this. Especially it depends on who's giving it, because if someone's giving the implicit bias training and they're essentially telling white people they're bad and they should feel guilty for being white or something like that, that is not a way to bring people together, right? And so this implicit bias training is, it is not a way of fixing the situation, right? A lot of times after implicit bias training, there's more racial animosity after the trainings, right? And so this too is not an effective policy to address the criminal justice issues and the racial issues within the carceral state. Now, conservatives have been really big on disenfranchisement, and disenfranchisement means that if you get convicted of a crime, you cannot vote. A great example of this is Florida. In the southern states, there's a large disenfranchised population in the southern states. Some states don't do it, and every state varies as to the degree of what we call civic death is applied into what conditions or what crimes it applies to. But Florida had a ballot initiative that said that, and the Floridians voted in 2016 when Trump got elected, that we're going to reinstate the voting rights of all felons. They passed that ballot initiative. Right after that, the Republican state legislature passed a law that said that you have to pay all your fines and fees first. So really what they did, the people of the state want these people to be able to vote, right? If you let them out of jail, you're saying they can come back into society, you should let them vote. And so what the Florida legislature said is that, no, we don't want them to vote. And so they put another barrier to making them vote. And you got to understand, some people get out of prison and they owe $200,000 in restitution, depending on the crime. So really what they're saying is you will never vote, right? You're like 40 years old, you owe $100,000 in restitution. You're paying $67 a month in restitution. You're never going to pay that off. You're going to go to debt. You're going to die with that. They're going to come to your grave and ask you for it. And you still can't vote, right? Also, building more prisons, right? So it's just like, how do you get rid of the problem, make more places to put it, right? And so it's like, I want to, it's like, it's not like, you want to quit eating cookies, you don't buy more cookie jars. And so Alabama has done this foolishness. Alabama prisons are so overcrowded. Overcrowding starts or has a tendency when you have overcrowding, you got people all on top of each other. It increases violence. It increases it's a public health hazard, as we can see with COVID. And, the problem is not that the police are overcrowded. The problem is you've got so many people in jail in the first place. And so Alabama, is under the DOJ. The DOJ is looking, they're about to sue them for the prisons. And so their idea is just to build more prisons, which is a waste of taxpayer money. And it doesn't solve the problem, because as soon as you build them, they will get filled up too. They will get filled up too. You have to stop the flow of people into prison, right? And then increasing police budgets. Now, increasing police budgets is, the police need resources, right? You got to pay people. They need equipment. I mean, to have a police department, people say, oh, all cops need to have body cams. To have a body cam system in a police department is $100,000 for a small department, right? Because it's not just having the equipment. You have to have the hardware, hard drives, and the software to be able to store all that equipment for years, right? It's an infrastructure, IT infrastructure you have to build. And so, police need resources if you want them to have things like that, right? But also, police budgets, it depends on what they're getting, right? And so if you give them money and they buy tanks and they buy rocket launchers and they buy drones and they buy robots that blow people up, like when they blew that guy up in Dallas, right? The money has to be tied to something other than armaments against citizens, right? So increasing police budgets is not ideal solution to crime, right? It's not an ideal solution to crime. And so what are some more liberty-focused perspectives, right? Policy solutions. A, decriminalization. We live in the United States where almost everything is criminalized. Decriminalization is not just like drugs, but also like decriminalize like a lot of these traffic laws, right? I mean, why should I get a ticket if I'm missing a headlight? Why do the police have to interact with me if my tag is expired, right? If I have an expired tag, that shouldn't be a ticket, a crime, right? You should just mail me something in the mail that says, hey, your tag's expired. Send us the money and we'll send you the sticker, right? And if I don't do it, you can fine me or something like that, but it shouldn't be a crime, right? Police should not be coming into contact with individuals for rudimentary, everyday, run-of-the-mill stuff, right? And so we have to decriminalize not just our drug laws, but a lot of laws, right? A lot of laws can go, right? Another thing is prosecutorial reform. In the United States, prosecutors are the most powerful individuals in the criminal justice system. Prosecutors decide what you get charged with, what plea deals, everything runs to a prosecutor. So there has to be a system to hold them accountable, right? Hold them accountable, because prosecutorial misconduct is not a serious offense. All right, and we also have to take some of that power out of their hands, because if you're going to a court, you should have a fair hearing in front of a judge, right? A jury of your peers. You shouldn't have the deck stacked against you going in. So prosecutorial reform is a serious one that could bring a lot of transparency and could bring a lot of fairness back into the criminal justice system. There's also qualified immunity, right? Now, qualified immunity is the idea that, let's say you work for the city and you drive a garbage truck, you pick up a dumpster and drop it on somebody's car. That person can sue the city, but they can't sue you, right? And so the same thing goes for police officers, qualified immunity. And the problem with qualified immunity, and I'll push back on this a little bit, is that yes, right? Police are not being held liable for the wrongdoing. Police are not being held liable for their infractions on our liberty. They're not being held liable for lying, for racial profiling, for whatever, right? They're not being held liable for this. So this is a way to hold them liable. However, right, if you're a police officer making $55,000 a year, how much money do you think you're going to get from that person? And if you take their pension or whatever, it's a lot that goes into that I think people are not seeing down the road. Like, what does his children and wife or husband or partner do to deserve the loss of their retirement, right? And so you're punishing an individual who A, doesn't even make that much money, and B, punishing that individual, like suing that individual holds him accountable, but does it hold the police department accountable, right? Does it hold the police department accountable? Now, there are arguments out there that police should have insurance, like malpractice insurance or whatever. But if you know anything about malpractice insurance, it's sky high. And if you have one malpractice suit, it becomes astronomical to get insurance again, right? So doctors deal with this all the time. And so there's ideas of insurance. There's ideas that the money so if you sue the city, so if you get beat up by a police officer, it's unjust, or it's always going to be unjust if you get beat up, I guess. If you get beat up by a police officer, you sue the city, not the police station. And so the city pays that money. It doesn't come out of the police budget. And so there are ideas about taking out the police budget. But again, police, they also need resources, right? They need to be able to run the computer systems, the IT systems to do the body cam. They have to have funds to do that. Another idea is collateral consequences. And so you may be not familiar with collateral consequences, but I'll explain to you in just a second. Once you become a felon, each state has a bunch of things you cannot do ever again outside of voting, right? Disenfranchisement. So if you become a felon, let's say in Alabama, which I'm most familiar with, if you become a felon in Alabama, you cannot get licensed to be a barber. You can't get licensed to drive semi-trucks. You can't get licensed to be a nail tech. Occupational licensing is off the table. Pretty much anything the state licenses you to do, a felony will preclude you from that. Also, it precludes you from federal funding for education. So you can't better yourself through education. It precludes you from any kind of federal public assistance. You can't get any of that. And so there are all these collateral consequences that come with getting a felony that are unjust, right? That are additional burdens or additional punishments that a person has to bear for the rest of their life, essentially, unless you get a pardon from the government or expungement from the governor, that prevent a person from re-entering society, from re-entering the economic market, from re-entering the education market, to trying to be a better person, to take advantage of the opportunities we have here in the United States. And so the big thing is that freedom is only good if you have the means and the tools able to take advantage of it. Liberty is only good if you have the ways and means to be able to take advantage of it, right? And so these collateral consequences are major hindrances to individuals' ability to re-enter society and to re-enter economic markets, to better themselves through education. And I'm not saying go and get like a law degree. I'm saying if they want to go to junior college and become a plumber or something, there's no opportunity for that because of these collateral consequences. And if you go to the ABA, the American Bar Association's website, you can look up your state and it'll give you a list of all the collateral consequences. I think there are like about 50,000 separate collateral consequences from getting a felony in all the states and territories. There are like 50,000 separate things. Like you can't get a license. Some states you get a felony, you can't get a license. Your license is automatically revoked, right? And think about it. If you got a felony, a non-driving felony, why would you revoke my license? Right now, I can't go to work. Now I can't go to court dates. Especially if you live in a place like in Arkansas that doesn't have like public transportation. How do I get to court? How do I get to work, right? All these things are set up to punish these individuals, but are also set up to do the maximum amount of punishment, right? This predation is invasive. It follows you throughout your life. And there are so many opportunities you are not able to capitalize on because of this contact with the criminal justice system, which is highly concentrated in certain zip codes, areas, and with certain people. So what you have is these negative consequences are much more likely to happen to you if you live in a certain zip code opposed to another, right? And so you have this disproportionate effect of these individuals, and namely people of color. And so, these are just some of the policy approaches. There are other policy approaches. I'm pretty sure that you all have ideas that you heard or kicking around. And so I'll stop right here.